Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to a new video. In this video I want to cover splines and spline meshes. Now this is not a new topic. Ryan Laley has posted a video on this many years ago explaining pretty much the same thing. I have made a few changes to it which I hope will make it somewhat unique, but I don't want to take any credit away from Ryan at all because the majority of this blueprint is made from Ryan Laley's code. So I will pop a link to that video down below, but like I said, I'm going to make some additions to it which I think will be beneficial. This video has not come out of nowhere really. It's just I needed to put some chains into one of my levels and I thought a spline would be the best way. Came across Ryan's video, really liked it, made some changes to his format, and then thought, well, I may as well share that to my community as well. So effectively we've got all these pipes running around the editor here, the area, some chains and then a fence panel, and all of these are being somewhat generated by the spline mesh renderer, let's call it. And the reason splines are really useful is, let's just move over to a better position, is this fence for example is made up of splines, and what we can do is we can just select a point over there. We can say actually I want my fence to go over there now, and it just makes some part of modeling and sort of setting up scenes so much quicker. Because instead of me worrying about, oh, I'll place that there, let me twist it around a little bit, the spline renderer does all of that for you. So you can move all these around, and as you can see, as I'm moving that back, there's just models being generated for me by the system, which is really nice. And if I just want to tweak these little bits here, I could just go into the rotate mode and say, actually I want it to be more like that, I want it to be more like that, and you can just tweak things, and that's my fence done. I don't need to worry about that. And the same with pipes really. We can just chuck a new one of these down here like this. Here we go, we've got a pipe, grab the end spline, put it back into move mode. Let's move that up. I want that to connect to the wall. Let's give myself a bit more space. I want that to connect to the wall, and then I want this end to be, I don't know, let's rotate it up. Now there are limitations. If you rotate models past the breaking point, let's call it, they will break. As you can see here, they will break, but if you're delicate with it, and you just take sort of the limitations of the mesh itself and the length of them into consideration, you get some really nice effects. So with some tweaking and some playing around, you can get pipes to seamlessly go into the ground like that, and they'll just render as many parts as you want, which is really nice because you can just chuck things together. Anyway, I've already spent 3 minutes talking about it. Let's get into it. Okay, so I've just put my scene back together, and let's just create the blueprint. So what you want to do is open up a new blueprint class. I'm going to select actor, and I'm going to call this BP underscore. I called this auto pipe, but let's just call it spline mesh. For this case, I called mine auto pipe because I literally just needed it for pipes and chains, so auto pipe was a good name. So we'll open up this spline mesh. And really all we need to do to start with is just purely add in a spline. So add that in now. Now not spline mesh, but make sure you pick spline itself. And here you can see this is a spline in its most basic format. So you've got a point here and a point here, and a line connects them together. So if you want to, you can move these points independently. And when you select a point, you get what's called these tangent points. And these tangent points allow you to make bends in your spline. If you've ever used anything like Photoshop or Illustrator, or maybe CAD, or something of like a 2D drawing environment, you will probably be familiar with these. The pen tool, for example, in Photoshop, it's exactly the same thing. And wherever this line or path goes, we can get things to happen along the way. Now, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. We're going to jump straight into it. So with your spline added, we're going to go to construction script. A construction script basically allows things to run on the fly. So your construction script will update or will run every time something is changed on the actor. So for example, in the world, if I was to move this actor from here to here, the construction script will run every time I move it. So that's a good place to put this type of sort of blueprint, because every time we make a change, we rotate it, we move it, we scale it up, the meshes that are required to make it look right will update at that time, which is perfect. We're going to need to set the length of our mesh. The reason this is important is because the system, the blueprint, needs to know how long is the mesh that I'm going to be generating, because it needs to take that into consideration. Let's say your mesh is 1 meter long, and it tries to generate a mesh every 100 centimeters. You're going to end up with 10 of the same mesh, and that might not look right. Or on the flip side of things, let's say you've got a meter wide mesh and you want to make a 10 meter long one. You don't want it to stretch that 1 meter to a 10 meter one, because it'll just look terrible. So it needs to take that into consideration. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable, and we'll call this mesh length. And this is going to need to be a float. We'll drag that in, we'll get the mesh length, and I'm going to compile this just so I can set the default value. I'm going to set it to 100, which in Unreal would be 1 meter. But we're going to make this instance editable and expose on spawn, because depending on what mesh you put in, you're going to need to type in the length of it. So with that being said, what we want to do is I'm not going to work in the same format that Ryan did. I'm going to work from start to finish, whereas Ryan puts it in sort of a functional order of let's get it to render, then let's get it to do this, and then let's get it to do that. I'm just going to work from front to back. If you need more of a structured approach, I'd go and watch Ryan's video. But what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the scale of it's going to be right. So what we're going to do is get actor 3D scale. And what we're going to do is we're going to split this. Whoops, not promote it to a variable. Let me delete that. Let me right click on this and split. Effectively, what we're going to do is every time you make one of these meshes, you're going to take the forward direction of your mesh. What I mean by that is if we open up this pipe, for example, if I look at it from a side view, what you can see is down here in this little gizmo, you've got the X going in this direction, Y coming towards us, and the Z going up in the air. So the X follows the sort of the direction of the mesh. So that's going to be our forward direction. So for that example, because of that, what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the mesh length by the X scale. So we probably want to come out of the X first, do a multiply, and we're going to multiply the mesh length by its scale. And then what we're going to do is we're going to promote this to a variable and call this section length. So effectively, this is going to be the number that we're going to feed into the system to say when the length is of a certain size, we need to generate another mesh. Yep. What we also need to do is we need to take in consideration what length of the spline is. So effectively, every time you make a new spline point, or if you scale it and drag it to the other side of the map, the length of it is going to change. And we need to take our mesh, and we need to take our spline, and we need to decide how many of these meshes can we fit along the length of this spline. So to do that, what we can do is grab a reference to our spline. We'll pull off that and we'll say get spline length. Very handy node. And then what we want to do is we actually want to divide this value by our section length. So let's grab our section length, and this will give us the number of meshes that will fit along the length. Now, to prevent it from giving you a half a mesh, so let's say if the division gives you a remainder of 0.5, you don't want to spawn half a mesh. So to prevent that from happening, you can do a truncate. This will sort of round down. So as the example shows here, 1.6 will become 1, and it just keeps it scalable in our mind. So what we want to do now is we want to loop over every spline point, because you can create multiple spline points. I'll show that after when we've got something that's usable. You can hold Alt and duplicate a spline point, and that's useful if you want to go around corners. It just gives you a bit more control over how the mesh looks visibly. So we'll do a for loop, so we can loop over each of these splines. And to find out how many times we need to loop over it, we're just going to plug it in our truncated figure as our last index, because effectively we need to repeat this process for however many meshes will fit along our spline. Then what we need to do is we need to add a spline mesh component. So this is what's actually going to physically render the object. This is, so if you've got your pipe or your chain or your fence or whatever you're going to be rendering, this is going to be the component which will actually make it visible on the screen. So that's fine. Now what we want to do from the return value is we want to go to, this is an addition from myself. I want to do a set mesh, because what this node requires, as you can see on the right, it requires a static mesh, which means if we run this, if we use this actor, this blueprint that we're creating, it will be the same mesh every time. I don't want that. I want to be able to make this reusable throughout my entire game, and not worry about having to make a brand new sort of spline mesh for a ladder, for a pipe, for whatever. I want to be able to use the same one for every asset. So what we'll do is we'll set the static mesh, but we're going to promote the static mesh to a variable, and we'll call this render mesh. And again, we need to make this instance editable and expose on spawn. But what I'm going to do, just so then my actor spawns something, I am going to set this as a default to my pipe. So I'll find my pipe. So by default, my pipe is going to render, but then whatever I overwrite it with in here will be represented. So again, I'm going to set pipe in here, just so then that's a default, which I'm absolutely happy with. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to tell the spline mesh component which direction is forward for it. So in this case, we're going to do set forward axis, and as I showed you earlier with the pipe, if you click on your object and if you look at this little gizmo down in the bottom, you can see that the mesh itself is sort of going in an X direction. That is the way that I want it to extrude, so X is going to be my forward. Now what I've also done is I've made a few other meshes, and effectively what I've done, I've just made sure that I've made them in the X direction. So here's a chain. Little note, if you want to make a chain, just cut the ends off so then when the meshes join together they look correct. But again, I've placed that on the X direction. If you've got a handful of assets already made that you want to use and they're not in this direction, you'll just need to change this. And if you want to use multiple meshes and they change forward axis, you probably want to set this to a variable as well, so you can change that on the fly. Make sure to set it to instance editable and expose on spawn, so you can change it from outside of this window. But we'll get to that later. I'm going to add a reroute node here just to make this look a little bit neater, and maybe another one just there. I'm going to plug that in. So that's our forward axis set for us. Now the next thing we might want to do is we might want to make our spline have collision enabled. Now areas that you might not want it to, or the reason why you might want it to be like an on and off switch, is I want this fence to be have collision, because it wouldn't be a fence without it. This pipe as well, with it being quite a large object, I want the physics to be not physics, the collision to be enabled. However, my chain is purely for decoration, so I don't actually want collision on this. So I've actually deactivated it because it doesn't require collisions, and if I do it, it just get in my way, and I don't want that to happen. So what we want to do is we want to say, let's drag off here and set collision enabled. And we want to set it to collision enabled, query and physics. Now, again, what I'm going to do, I want this to be a yes or a no question, so I have the choice of changing that when I want to. So I'm actually going to put a branch, I'm going to put a branch in here. And only if I say yes, it's true, I want this to be enabled. If it's false, then I want to do something else. So I'm just going to add a reroute node there before we continue. And this branch is going to need a boolean, so I'm just going to create a variable, promote a variable, and I'm going to change the name of it to collision enabled. And by default, I'm going to have the collision enabled. I'm only going to turn it off if I know I need to, but I think by default it's probably best to have that enabled. So that's absolutely fine. So once you've got your collision enabled, the next thing really is to set up where the actual points are going to go. So we're going to need to drag another one of these, reroute node, and we're going to need to set the start and end distance of our spline. So let's do set start and end. There we go. Let's plug this in. And again, we need to plug this executable in. Effectively, this is just, no matter what, we still want a start and an end position, but we might want to not enable collision, which will prevent that from working, so that's absolutely fine. Okay, so this is where I'm going to say, if you want a detailed explanation about this point, Ryan Laley's video's the place to go, but I'll talk through it as best as I can. So for a starting position and an ending position is relatively straightforward. So a start position is going to be our very first spline length that we loop through. So we're going to take our index, I'm going to type in reroute, add a reroute, let's do that, and our start position, our first index is going to be sort of like spline 0, but we want to take into consideration our section length. So we're going to do a multiply, and this one's going to be section length. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Let's drag that in and make the conversion. So we've got section length, and the reason that we're going to need to do this is because we're going to do get location by distance. So 0 times our length is going to be right at the beginning, so it's probably going to be, well, anything times 0 is 0, so the first position's always going to be 0. So from here, let's do, actually, sorry, we do need our spline to make this work. Grab our spline reference, get spline, and drag off that. So set what's the node called? Set location by distance. Or is it get location? There it is, get location. Get location at distance along spline. So that's going to be our first one. So we'll plug that into start. And our distance is going to be 0 effectively, because we're doing 0 times 0. But we also want to do the same thing to get the tangent. So our start tangent is going to be the same, 0. So it's going to be get tangent at distance along spline. There's so many similar ones, and I knew I was going to say the wrong one. So that's absolutely fine. Let's plug that start tangent in. We do actually need to make a change here. Actually, let's do that now. So let's clamp this. Actually, I'm not going to clamp it, and I'll show you why clamping is required. So for the next one, what we need to do is let's take this reroute node from here. Let's drag off that. We're going to go to an add, and we're going to add 1 to it. Because effectively, the first instance this runs, it's going to be 0. So this is going to run, set our first location at 0, and we don't want to set the end position to 0 as well. So we'll add 1 to it to move it down the line by 1 position. Then from that, we want to do a times. We're basically doing the same thing here, so let's copy that. We'll paste that, not paste that, we'll plug that into there. Then from this, we need to do the same thing again here. So let's copy both of these and plug these both into there like that. So for our end position, we'll just plug that straight in, and for our end tangent, we'll do the same thing. We'll plug that straight in. So that's pretty much it, to be honest. This is going to work nicely, but I just want to go over why we're going to want to change the tangents. So let's compile that, and let's drag one of these into our game. So we've got our spline mesh here we've just created, and as you can see straight away we've got a pipe. So we'll drag this up, and then what you can do, if you can see, by default it's starting at the first position, or sorry, not the first, the position 0, which is in effect the first position. And then the second position, you can just grab that by clicking on these little white squares. Now, please be aware that when you click on one of these splines, it will show you the tangents. And if you grab one of these and start moving that around, you're going to start deforming your mesh. Just be conscious that it's usually the nodes in between. They are slightly larger, if you can tell. It's probably not that visible, but they are slightly larger. So this will move this end, and then this will move this end, but the smaller cube in between is going to be that tangent rotation. So just be aware of that. And if you want to select the whole mesh, just click off it, click back on, and this is going to move the whole thing together. But if you click on this spline point and then back to this first spline point, then it'll move the spline rather than the object. So just some sort of quality of life before you get into it. But what you can see now is as I move this down, you can see a bit of an error. So what's actually happening is as I'm dragging this along, the tangent is also growing with it. So it's actually stretching these flanges effectively on the pipe, and not causing them to sort of mesh together. The only one which is somewhat right is this end piece, but the rest of them are just getting larger and larger the closer we get to the beginning. So to do that, what you want to do is add in a clamp, but you want to clamp it to the section length. So what that means is let's make a bit more space here in between these two. I'm going to drag my section length and just pop it there, get section length. And what we want to do is we want to clamp the tangents. So clamp vector size, and the maximum is going to be our section length. So what it's saying is if the tangent cannot be any bigger than the mesh itself, and that will prevent that from happening. So plug that into the end tangent, and then again for this one, clamp vector size, section length is the maximum, and then we'll plug that into the start tangent. So what I can do now is just make this subtly neater by moving that down there. And I'll put in a couple of reroute nodes just so then everything's nice and tidy. Plug that there, pop that there, and move that back a little bit. Yeah, so that looks fine. Let's hit compile. Let's go back, and now you can see, now we've compiled it, it's now corrected the tangents. So that's pretty neat, and let's just make sure all of our changes we've made have gone into effect. So our boolean for do we want the collision enabled. I forgot to set that to instance editable and expose on spawn. So that's now the render mesh that was the and the mesh length. We just need to make sure the mesh length's there as well. So that's fine. Hit compile. Let's go back. So this looks a little bit broken at the moment. Everything looks a little bit squidged up, and that's because I've not set in my mesh length. So the way for you to check is if you can see here, it's somewhere in the middle. It says approximate size. It says 400 by 110 and 105. Now, knowing my longest length on that is going to be the X, that's going to be 400. What I can do is I can type in my mesh length is going to be 400, and you'll watch it update. Now I've got two pipes next to each other and the start of my next pipe. So let's move that back. So that's looking pretty good. That's looking pretty good. So that's now connected to the wall. And if I want to, let's rotate that 90 degrees. Let's put that down. I want to connect that to the floor. So now I've got a nice bendy pipe. Let's move that up. Now let's say that doesn't look too good. If you want to make it look a little bit nicer, what you can do is just let me rotate this back. Come on, one more. Come on. Oh, maybe I did leave it at 80. Never mind. If you want to make this look a little bit better, if you hold the Alt key and move, you'll notice now that I've got another dot here. So I've actually split this spline into 3 pieces now. So by holding Alt, you're actually adding to the spline, which is fine. But what that allows me to do is it allows me to make tighter bends, because the rotation's applying from this point to this point rather than the whole thing. So that's a little neat little tip. So I'm going to put that there like that. This looks horrible at the moment. I can see that. Let's just try and fix this to make it look as good as possible. I did mention at the beginning that you've got to take into consideration the geometry that you're working with. So with this being a 4-meter pipe, a 400 unit pipe, I've got to take that into consideration when I'm trying to make my bends. If I was to use a shorter pipe, I'd probably be able to make tighter corners with it. And if I was to apply a bit more geometry to it, that would also help too. So there you go, you got a pipe. And if I decided, oh, I don't want a pipe now actually, I want this to be a chain, you can change that to a chain. But now I need to change my mesh length. So let's hover over my chain. I can see this is 200 by 22 by 22. And just another quick little tip as well. If you double click on it and open it, you can see here that my approximate size is 199 by 21 by 21. Obviously the outer screen has just rounded up, but I'm going to round up too. So I'm going to type in 200, and now my chain is rendering as I expect it to. Again, let's just double check to make sure everything's functioning as expected. So we've got collision enabled. Let's go and try that. So I was going to say we'll run over here, but I've not got a run on this game. So I can walk into it. You can see there that the collisions are enabled. But then if I decide, no, this is just for cosmetics, I don't want things to be able to collide with it, it's going to be off in the background, you can disable the collision, and now I can walk straight through it. So thank you to Ryan Laley for posting that original video, which has been able to help me out using these splines. You know, please visit his video. You know, this video wouldn't have been possible without his. But if the additions that I've made to it have made it more useful, please consider giving me a like. If you like this video in general, please consider giving me a like, or commenting down below. I do appreciate comments, and I do respond to all of them. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Shout out to the Discord server. Links down below. We've got a Discord server. There's a community of quite a few of us, which we're all happy to help. I do respond a lot quicker on Discord, I would say, than YouTube comments. Not that I prioritize Discord. It's just that YouTube sometimes delays the comments for unreasonable amounts of time, so sometimes it might be 6 hours later before I get a notification saying you've commented, whereas on Discord I'm on that pretty much all the time and I can get back to you as soon as I can. If you want to see more content, please consider subscribing, and I'm going to stop talking now, and I appreciate you watching it this far. Thank you very much, and see you in another one.